from Ghana yesterday after a turbulent trip across the region, and he will have the honor and the pleasure of taking us to the end of the summer school with his always rich, thought-provoking, and provocative ideas. So he will help us maintain the spirit of this summer school, which has been one of hard, critical, intellectual engagement. Um, so he's my colleague at the University of Basel, and he's a professor of political science, but by training he's also a sinologist and a, a philosopher, mainly a philosopher, and he's been very influential also in carrying the intellectual agenda of this summer school. He's been with us right from the start. So the two of us are the constants in this summer school. And then from CODESRIA, we usually have different colleagues from around the continent. But we are the most stable. We are the stable part of faculty for this. And the funny thing is that we don't do anything except that it's good to have the summer school and to have, and to have the discussions. So I think that's been very stimulating, at least for me. And that's why I'm always happy. And I'm very happy that he was able to make it. I mean, he he traveled from Ghana yesterday, and he's traveling with me back to Switzerland tonight. So I mean that shows also his commitment to our program here. Anyway, I will give him the floor, and he will take us through the morning.
Thank you so much, Eliseo. I think we have much more agreement than you think we have. But it's also good to know that we disagree on many things. No, yeah, I'm happy to be here, but of course also sorry to be here so late, right? I really looked forward to spending a week with you, have lunch, maybe in the evening, exchange. So this is a very, very short version of the summer school for me. Right, and I really, really regret that, because this summer school, as Eliseo said, I think it's the fourth or fifth, I can't even count, time that I'm here, but it's also usually one of the highlights of my year. Actually, I really enjoy this, and a lot has come out of the summer school, also in terms of continued collaboration, of interchange, exchange. So it's really something that I hold dear. It has been controversial at times, and I'm sure it will be controversial today. But as Eliseo said, actually, I think it's good. And when we come to the discussion, it might be one thing that academia is about, right? Disagreeing. So in that sense, you're welcome. Now, I'm not sure whether we can put up the slides again. There seems to be, it has the made us going into hibernation mode. But I just say something about the title of today and then what I want to do, right? The title is Normativity, the Politics of Values. Now, as far as I understood, and Eliseo brought me up to speed a little bit about the week's discussions, right? I think politics of values and how values can be politicized, whether they're always political, I think this has come up quite a bit during the week, right? So naturally, I think it lends itself to finish the week also with that. I also thought that I will focus in the first part up until the break on the question that actually guides the entire summer school, right? About how political is knowledge. Because I'm sure you heard a lot about this question during the week, and you asked that question many times. But I hope that we can ask the question still differently today at the end of the week, because you've been thinking about that for a week, right? And I want to just give my input on that question. I was thinking that this might be better than flooding you with an additional topic, right, with even more, because today's the last day and we should try to sum it up somehow. After the break, I brought with me one author that I think that some of you might know, but that I also think captures a bit of the spirit of this week. It's Boaventura de Sousa Santos, the Colonial Thinker. And I brought with me many quotes by him that we can discuss. What do we do with these quotes after having thought about the question, how political is knowledge, for 1 week? That's when we will probably get a little bit controversial. But now, let me just try to say something, and I will not talk the entire time, otherwise you will all doze off and sleep probably, right? We'll have some discussion. We also have a little exercise where I want you actually to think and tell me what you came up with, right? But I think the question, how political is knowledge, what we should always do is, what are we actually asking when we're asking how political is knowledge? And why is that important in the first place? Because there's a lot of consequences, I think, and I believe, if we are not asking what we are asking. So there might be presuppositions in the question that we don't understand, right? Presuppositions that one person might have, but not the other. So how can we discuss about the common question if we're not clear what we mean by it? Worse, if one doesn't talk about the question, we might just exchange generalizations, right? Maybe problematic generalizations. And finally, if one discusses a question like the one, how political is knowledge? I mean, take a second, how big is that question? It's huge. I'm sure 1 week didn't suffice in any way to get closer to that question, maybe a little bit, right? Then we risk banality. And that's not where we want to end up with. So we will, I hope, complexify the question even further, although I'm sure that we already heard a lot about it, and I missed it, I wasn't there. First thing that philosophers like to do, I mean, the words in there. How political is knowledge? I will not talk about the E's, although I'm tempted, but political, right? And I know that you heard a bit about that also before, about the political, understandings of the political. And that would be an endless discussion, right? I do teach the history of political thought, and it's largely a discussion about what the political is, right? It's a lot there. I just want to give you maybe one distinction that I believe will be helpful later on again. And it's a distinction that a critical theorist has introduced, Raymond Geuss. And he talks about two ways of how the political can be thought about and has been thought about. One is the politics as subspecie consensus. I'm sorry for the Latin term. He calls it that way. But it means an understanding of politics and political that is largely focused on consensus, on reaching consensus. The presupposition being that in politics, there's actors who believe that they do politics in order to reach an agreement, to reach the common between the people, to reach a consensus on which then you can build beyond diversity, beyond disagreement. So easily you will recognize that's a liberal understanding of politics in many ways. Liberal political theorists would often follow such an understanding. On the other hand, there's politics understood subspecie belli as a kind of war, that means struggle. The idea there, the presupposition is there's never agreement, there's never consensus. There's always hegemony, there's fight, there's struggle. That's what politics is. Politics means that you can't overcome struggle. It's always the powerful asserting him, herself over the other. Now, easily, stores maybe as an easy example, Marxist, right? Marxism would be an understanding of politics as a struggle, which can only be overcome by actually winning, right? Winning out against those elements in society which you try to overcome. Now, knowledge, I'm sure you talked about that a lot, and we will talk about that again later on. Definitions of knowledge abound, right? Philosophy has been busy thinking about knowledge for all its existence, right? There is one maybe classical definition that nowadays in philosophy departments is no longer the dominant one, but I still think it's a helpful one. And some of you might know that definition, knowledge as justified true belief, right? It's a notion because of get-here problems in philosophy. We've become much more sophisticated about that, but I still use it a lot myself, right? And the thinking of knowledge as a belief that you have about something, and a belief that is true, and you have justification for believing it. Think of having, let's say, I assume that you have, I don't know, $50 in your pocket, right? And it so happens that you have $50 in your pocket. And the justification is that I've seen you putting $50 in your pocket, right? Now I know that you have $50 in your pocket. It's a justified true belief. Now, if it is that you have $50 in your pocket, but I just guessed, right? Guessing is not justification. So my belief is still true, right? But it's not justified. So these three elements would be a classical way of understanding knowledge in philosophy. And the how is also important. How political is knowledge? Think about the way that we ask this question. We could have asked it in so many other ways, right? It seems presupposed in the question that knowledge is political. So we already answered the question, is knowledge political? With yes, and now we're asking, so how political is it? The answer to the how could be a lot. You could answer how political knowledge saying, oh, it is very political, or a little bit, right? But you seem to have, it's a question of grade, right? You're not trying to find out. Or you could say, no, how means how political is knowledge? Is it political in this way or in that way, right? So it would be an answer to the question, how is knowledge political? In what ways? And I think it's well worth, and we'll do that in a second, it's well worth to think about knowledge, all forms of knowledge, some knowledge, right? Knowledge can be many things. You could describe knowledge, so there's a descriptive understanding of knowledge, like, are there $50 in your pocket, right? Or I could ask, should there be $50 in your pocket, right? Maybe you just did a shady deal and now there's $50 in your pocket, right? Should it be that way? No, knowledge, right? And to know that, whether it should or not, now is the normative understanding of knowledge. Now, when we ask how political is knowledge, I said we already ruled out that, or we already answered in a way that knowledge is political. And I just want to point out to the extremes of how you could answer that. You could say all knowledge is political. Just all knowledge, always, everywhere, is political. And I would assume that some of you actually entertain such a notion, right? Now, in philosophy, often we would say, oh, that's a conceptual overstretch. If a concept applies to everything, anything, everywhere, what worse does it have? It can no longer discriminate, right? There's no tension coming up. So you would possibly mean then something that's just a condition of human existence or something, right? Which is fine. One could and can entertain that view. And the opposite is if you say, no, knowledge is never political. Well, right, you're probably engaging in some sort of naivete, right, towards politicization of the world. You might think, people defend that. Often you look at them and think, how naive can you be? Don't you know about the realities of the world, right? About politics, right? So these are the two ends, I think, of the spectrum. And it will be interesting to see where we can land in the middle, if that is where we should land. A final point, how political is knowledge? It's just who's asking the question, right? So positionality. In recent years, a lot of discussions about positionality, right? Again, you can have a spectrum there. You can think, we're all asking the same question. But that means you've settled those discussions about the political, the knowledge, and so on, right? Or you can say, no. Each and everyone is asking the question for him, herself. We all have a different question, actually. Well, good luck with the discussion about it, right? Are we then ever progressing in any way? Or maybe to illustrate it in a different way, it might well be that Elisa and me, who would disagree on everything, would say, how political is knowledge? He would say the one thing, I would say the opposite. And it would mean that we agree, because we understand the question very differently, right? Or it could be that we say the same thing, but we disagree. You see how big the mess can be if we're not trying to be clear on what do we mean by political and knowledge. In philosophy, often the answer to when do you have a contradiction is when you say you have two different answers to the same question. But that means it should be the same question. How do we ever know we have the same question, right? Positionality is a good way to challenging yourself and saying, oh, maybe we don't have the same question. Maybe we've got, I don't know how many we are, 30 different questions and 30 different answers. And often in such a big group, it's actually, I think, how a workshop starts out with, right? Different expectations, different experiences, all of that, right? But now we're at the level of my little mind here, right? Trying to figure out what the question is and what the answer. But in a group, over a week's time, I would hope, there's some anchor points you could put, right? Where we start to agree on some things sufficiently enough, I would say, so that communication is possible. Communication is only possible if you agree on some things somehow to some degree. We never understand each other, right? We just never. It sounds innocuous, but when I explained that to my mother, she was crying. My mother wants to understand her son. Right? I told her philosophically impossible. Right? It wasn't a good idea of mine. But communication rests on shared assumptions, and then, on the other hand, you never understand each other fully. So you communicate because you do not understand each other fully, right? So these are points that have been raised, and I hope we're now sufficiently confused and sensitized to how big that question is, how political is knowledge. And we can come back to certain elements of this, like understandings of politics as we go along. It would be nice if we listen to each other to try to think, oh, what concept of the political are you applying? What do you understand by knowledge? That's how we, I think, can progress. So I've talked already enough. I just want to do a little exercise. And it's, I hope, a challenging one. I told you already, I believe that probably some of you entertain the notion that everything's political. All knowledge is political. So I think I could challenge you maybe with a little exercise. And I wonder whether we could do it a little bit for 2 by 2, discussing with each other, and then we bring it together. And the challenge actually is, can you come up with a form of knowledge, with a sentence that expresses knowledge that is not political? That's just not political. Can you come up with a knowledge that you can point out to? It can be a sentence that exemplifies it, right? That you would say and argue, it is not political. Just not political, right? So if everything's political, you cannot come up with one, but still try. right? We do things for the sake of argument also, right? We're not here doing politics. We want to find out, can we think of a sentence? Can we think of a form of knowledge that we would feel comfortable arguing, not political? Now also think of what you have to think through to answer that question, right? I'm not sure how much time we would need for that, but maybe 10 minutes, 15 minutes, something like that. And then we try to see whether anybody actually can make the case, and we will learn something from it, I think, when we discuss it.
And you thought I was the difficult one.
Moi, je voulais te demander si vous vous êtes concerté avec le professeur, si vous vous êtes concerté avant qu'il ne prenne la parole, parce que on a comme l'impression que c'est ce que vous nous faites qu'il veut encore nous faire. Oui.
C'est ça que nous sommes obligés de faire.
Oui, je voulais parler. On va travailler en binôme, mais certains ont les difficultés de langue, English and French.
Okay, let us try to come together again. So I saw you all discussed very vividly. I don't know what you discussed about, but the discussions seem to be very vivid. Now let's try to bring that together, right? And probably we do follow the principle of self-selection first. Anybody wants to volunteer? Like, who has come up with something? Please.
C'est bon? On peut commencer? Ok. Merci beaucoup. Comme je le disais, j'ai déjà comme l'impression que nous sommes en train de retomber dans le même cercle dans lequel le professeur Makamuro nous mettait depuis le début de cette école d'été. Parce que déjà, à quel point la connaissance est politique, le thème central de l'école d'été, jusque-là, à mon avis, ne nous a pas encore été explicitement détaillé. Et quand nous allons finir ce matin, j'ose croire que aussi bien le professeur Weber et le professeur Makamo vont nous dire ce que nous devons garder en partant d'ici sur le thème central de l'école d'été. Parce que trouver une phrase qui montre que la connaissance n'est pas politique nous amène d'abord à nous poser des questions sur le thème central. La connaissance en tant que quoi? La politique étant aussi polysémique, c'est-à-dire enfin plusieurs sens. De quel point de vue de la politique on parle? Et sans ces détails, il nous sera difficile de trouver une réponse. Lorsque j'ai voulu postuler à l'école d'été, en même temps que j'ai trouvé le thème intéressant, c'était vraiment comme un casse-tête chinois pour moi. J'ai veillé des nuits durant en téléchargeant des tas de documents à lire sur la connaissance, le savoir, parce que chaque fois je me dis, bon, est-ce que connaissance équivaut à savoir? Est-ce que politique ici équivaut aussi à pouvoir? J'étais complètement perdue. J'avais des tas de documents que j'ai téléchargés, imprimés, et chaque nuit, j'étais au milieu des documents en train de chercher. Donc, je n'ai pas la réponse à la question du professeur. J'ai échangé avec Vanel et Lebon. Peut-être qu'ils ont une réponse, mais moi, je n'en ai pas encore. Merci.
Thank you so much for this. I've never heard the expression Castel Chinois. I learned something, even on top of what I wanted to learn. But the same circle, you said, right? And of course, there's a question whether ever there is something like the same circle, right? As Elisa stressed, we disagree on a lot of things, and maybe it's still two circles. We'll see, at least two circles, right? But it's the same. I think this is also how you treat the topic. You encircle it in a sense, right? And you do rounds around the topic. So if anybody would now come up and say that you have an answer, how political is knowledge? You found knowledge that is not political. Of course you're wrong, right? You're always wrong about these things. But also you're never right, right? You cannot be right, so you're always wrong. Because we don't understood what you mean then. Right? There's a lot of this in it. But I also think that if we go out, and I'm sure some of you publicly argue, defend arguments, charge others with something, charge others by saying, you don't understand how your knowledge is political. And you might carry away the day, right? But when you go home, I hope you ask yourself, what did I actually mean by saying that? Right? Am I sure I understood what I charged the person with? So it's also a question of how we debate, right? It's easy to score points. It's much harder to understand why you scored the point and in what exactly you scored the point, right? So I think it's important to do this encircling, and it will continue, I hope, when we go home. I will take hopefully a lot of points that I will encircle me in my plane trip back, right? with this. And I think you also pointed out rightly, of course, politics is polysemic. It's like there's much meaning in it, right? But let's try to find out. So I would I think enjoy if somebody could give me a sentence, give me a form of knowledge you think is not political, if you would have to argue. Please, and then we go around like this.
Thank you. I think maybe I might slide a bit also to the former speaker, because if you are saying knowledge is political, and there's every argument to argue that. Perhaps there is not any argument to argue that it is not. You can never formulate a sentence that says knowledge is not. Waking up and wearing these clothes, it's political. Living, breathing, why don't I die? You know, knowledge will always be political. Even when you ask your mom, how are you doing, mom? It's already political. You know, why are you asking that? You know, there's always it. So I don't think there is knowledge that we can formulate. If in every turn, when we argue knowledge is political, we can formulate every, like you just said, means that maybe there is just an impossibility. And then now when you said that it's always my understanding, and the other, we only know, we know knowledge also is political, also in an experiential perspective, because you might think your knowledge is universal, it's not political, but I tell you what this knowledge does to me. So therefore, I can be the one who also validates, you know, and even when we disagree, for example, coloniality is in the fact that coloniality does something for their colonizer. And then, you know, and when I respond back as decoloniality also does something back. So it's always that thing of always doing to each other. Thank you.
Thank you so much. You gave a case rather for the variant that every knowledge is political, right? And I think all fair and fine what you said, but I think it's the easier case in a sense. And I do think that later on we'll see how in your answer you actually gave us some elements, maybe to understand how you asked the question. You said what knowledge does to people, right? So that presupposes there's knowledge, and then this knowledge is used, right? And it does something to people. So I think there's a way of thinking about knowledge and politics where the politics comes in when something is done with the knowledge. Now, is the politics in the knowledge or not? You see, when you say it does something to people, we actually now have knowledge and a context to it, right? And then something is done with that knowledge to people. And now we have politics, and I couldn't agree more. But the challenge is the politics already in the knowledge? There's also ways to argue that. But you gave us a nice way to differentiate now, because that's what we want to do, right? At the end of this morning, I want to see a map. And I want to see knowledge, different versions of which. Sometimes the politics might be in the knowledge. We might discuss that. Sometimes the politics might be in what it does. It's in the context, how you phrase it, right? And I think we can learn something from that.
I just
Please.
wanted to say, when I frame it, for me, the knowledge is already political, whether it has done something. The fact that I'm framing from a context, from why am I asking the question I am asking? There's politics even within me, even that knowledge coming out. So it's already framed by what I've seen as a young person growing up, by whatever. So for me, when it comes up, even being before it's born because of politics.
Let's do a round. Please, yeah.
Merci. Moi, je soutiens la thèse que la connaissance n'est pas forcément politique, que la connaissance n'est pas toujours politique et que la connaissance n'est pas radicalement politique. Et mon ami et moi avons soutenu l'idée que pour vivre heureux, il faut s'éloigner de la politique. Parce qu'on part de l'idée que la politique est un espace de conflit, la politique est un espace de contradiction. Et pour reprendre un peu Emmanuel Kant, on peut dire que la politique est un champ de bataille où il n'y a ni vainqueur ni vaincu, et que la politique est un champ de ruine. Et de ce point de vue, effectivement, elle est incompatible avec la connaissance. Donc, si je ne sais pas, si je ne me perds pas, je pense qu'en fait, pour ne pas être dans la souffrance, pour ne pas vivre dans une contradiction, il faut véritablement s'éloigner de la politique et vivre heureux. Parce que celui qui vit heureux, c'est celui qui est dans un état de quiétude, dans un état d'ataraxie, pour reprendre un peu les philosophes, celui qui vit dans le bien-être. Or, on sait très bien qu'effectivement, la connaissance qui est à la base de la politique, cette connaissance elle-même peut tout simplement ruiner l'être humain, parce que c'est une connaissance effectivement qui implique des conflits, des contradictions, et même des guerres en fait. Voilà. Peut-être je vais laisser.
Thank you so much. We heard the philosopher speaking very clearly, right? And making a case for the view that not everything is politics, right? So we're circling right now around what I called possibility of conceptual overstretch. Everything's political. Still have to find out to what extent that might be a problem or not, right? And now a plea for, no, there must be a distinction between knowledge that is political and knowledge that is not political, or between knowledge and politics as such. Thank you so much, please.
Okay, good morning. I agree with my friend Lerato that the fact that we can conceptualize ideas and knowledge based on our experiences and socialization makes it already political. But further than that, some knowledge are still universally political. When you make a statement like, without food, people will die, I believe that is a universal consensus. So maybe, like the professor introduced initially, there is politics of consensus and otherwise. So based on this, I would say that some political knowledge is universal, like without food, humans would die. Thank you.
Thank you so much also for giving us a concrete example to think about. Right? So you said, without food, people would die. It's a belief that you hold, right? There's justification by seeing that if people don't have food, they die, right? Maybe empirical justification in that case, right? Maybe justified because other people have told you. So knowledge that you gather by testimony, one would say, right? There's different ways how knowledge can be justified, right? This will be important, I think, later on, right? And it's true, right? Because if you put a person into a room, no food will die, right? We know that. So it's knowledge. Still, you said political universal, right? Which is interesting. Now, I would almost want to understood how you try to combine that, right? Because if everything's political, then also this universal to some extent is political. But I wanted to ask you, at what point and how, in your view, does the sentence, that knowledge, the belief, let's say that belief, without food people would die, become political?
That is where the question of what kind of food comes in. Some people say there is healthy food. Some say this food is not healthy enough. And there are instances of healthy and unhealthy food. Some say this food is not sufficiently healthy. Like when you don't eat enough of proteins, you suffer kwashiorkor. So these differences in culture, and then some people see some food and believe it's outright wrong because they are not used to that kind of food. So I think this cultural differences is where the politics comes in, even in the universality of that knowledge.
Brilliant, thank you. Right? Most people would agree, I would assume. But what have you done now? You've taken the sentence, without food, people would die, and you added adjectives in there. Without enough food, without healthy food, without this sort of food. Now we qualify the sentence, right? And now I think many people would, oh, we're now in a political dimension, right? But were we in that dimension when we just said without food, people will die? Or is that where you now politicize, where we make it a political statement? I'm not saying this is the case. I just try to rationalize what you're saying, right? And then it was interesting to observe that when you gave meaning to the argument that without food people would die might be a political universal, now we had to qualify, we had to be more specific, right? And then we agree. I can easily see that. Of course, there's a food politics, there's poverty, there's all. It's a long-standing right, problem. And who would say that's not political in one way or another? We could still go into how exactly and so on, concepts of the political, but we would agree. But it's interesting how we had to qualify, right? And it's often that case. I mean, there's philosophers among you, but often in philosophy, when we talk about what is true, for instance, we're at the level of saying if when it rains, that's true, right? And then we have complicated ways of it's possible, the modality and things like that. We can complexify that a little bit, but you never get to the complexity of life, right? It's not doable. Philosophers are actually quite humble in that regard. Nowadays, we talk in a very deflated way about those things in philosophy, right? And I think there's something there between just saying without food people will die and without this kind of food and so in these conditions and such, right? There's something happening there. And I think we're then closer to where politics comes in. But that would mean there's a way of saying it that is not political, right? So maybe that we're getting somewhere maybe there, right? Maybe that can be challenged. We're going in circles. That's what we do here. Now let me see. I think there was a hand then and then a hand, please.
Okay, good morning. There is advantage and disadvantage in speaking behind elites like seated here, because someone disadvantage in the sense that someone might have already spoke your mind, and advantage in the sense that someone would have paved a way for you to come up with what you were struggling to articulate. Here, what we looked at, it was difficult. Clara, and Yumba, it was difficult to come up with a knowledge that actually we believe it is not political, in the sense that any other statement that we come up with, we raise questions in regards to it being innocent of politics. But the more we ask questions about it, the more we realize that there is an element of politics in it. So we assume or believe that a statement can be made, like someone have said, a universal statement can be made, and if it is left like that, then it may not carry some element of politics in it. But the more you ask questions, why, how, when, then those double questions will begin to show its nature of politics in it. So we said, okay, one, we may not go to deep concepts, knowing fully well that all concepts, like we have been saying here over and over, are not innocent of politics. If you critically scrutinize that concept very well, you see an element of politics. So we said, okay, why don't we look at what we're doing here? Everybody's having a bottle of water. And we said, yes, universally, human beings need water. And if water, whatever you use it for depends on you, the way you want to view it. But the concept of human beings needing water is universal. And that's what we agreed. We agreed on and said that until you dig into why you need water, what you're going to use it for, and when should you use it for, then those principles or concepts of why, how, when, and all those stuff will now turn it to be political. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. I mean, there's a long-standing discussion on these universals in terms of anthropological constants, right? It's a discussion that has raged in the entire 20th century, and it also got a lot of criticism, right? And that, I think, is one way of criticizing those things, right? But it's not quite clear whether that takes away from the statement that all people need water. Like we're almost in a similar, right? You said when, how, when, so when we add that to that, then we're quickly in politics. So I think there's a real interesting thing in there, in this distinction between the sentence and the belief that I hold, right? And I mean, who holds beliefs? We do that as individuals. We do that as groups, right? Between an individual and a group, politics easily enters also, right? So there's a lot of things that we still need to add to all of this, I think. And you also said something that I found interesting, because you said there's an element of politics in there, right? If politics, everything is political, then there's an element of politics everywhere. That's the question, is that element in there or is it added to it? That's why I think what we're a little bit discussing, right? Is it in there really? Because we're focusing on the political because, politics, some definitions would also say it's about the existential. Politics is often about death and life, right? It's about enemies and so on. Politics takes us very quickly to a space where it's existential, right? But couldn't I say, everything is economic. Everything is economic. I'm sure somebody paid for their bottle of water, right, that we are drinking here for free. So from that point of view, why we're not having the discussion, is all knowledge economic, right? I'm sure everything's legal. So there's an element of legal in there. Why we're not having the discussion, what are the rules and conditions under which it was possible that this water is on the table today, right? There's a legal framework behind it. If I steal your water, you might bring me to court, right? And so on and so forth. So there's often a focus on the political, which I understand because it's so existential. But if concepts are such that they predicate across every context, right? Everything. Then I can come up with a long list of such concepts, and the political would be just one of them, if that is so, right? And I think, again, that maybe points towards the direction that when we say there's an element of politics in there, we need to think whether that element is in there or we add it. In there. So one sec.
I forgot. So why is he saying human beings need water? Living things need water. The earth needs water. Everyone needs water. So it cannot be that it's human beings. Therefore, it is political because he's representing himself as a human being, whether universal and whatever. But all living things need to water.
Thank you. I'm not a biologist, but I think there's forms of life on this planet that don't need water. But I'm not sure. If you're a little cell or something, right? I'm not a biologist. I'm sure somebody could answer. But I think you made a point there, right? When you say all people need water, we can know that. That's our question, right? Is the knowledge wrong if you're too specific, right? Because the sentence can be, I can know that all people need water, but I can also know that all living beings need water, right? So the way you turned it was interesting, because you then said, why is he presenting it that way, right? And it's, I think, important, because we have, I think, nowadays, it's very hard to distinguish when we critically reflect about positionality and when we make an ad personam argument. Very tricky territory. But usually we say, if you pick on somebody, right, and say, why did you say that? I just saw you with the $50 in your pocket buying all that water, or something like that, right? We would think, oh, now you're arguing ad personam. So at the person, it's herself, right? Which is usually not considered to be a good way of arguing, right? But when you try to critically reflect positionality, which we all like nowadays, right, and which has its advantages and disadvantages, I think, right, then you try to do something else. So we don't go into the details of what this was, right? I'm just trying to observe what is happening, right? And I think that especially if we later on also discuss decoloniality, right? Positionality, of course, is very strong, right? It's almost the fire that drives decoloniality. A large part of the argument is about positionality. It would be interesting whether we could think decoloniality without positionality and what that would do, right? But we get there in the afternoon. But I think, yeah, this is good, right? Forth and back, we need to understand what dimensions are there, right? But here I just said it theoretically, the understanding of there's an element, a political element, right? But I still have the challenge out there. Couldn't we say that about everything? If concepts are so big that they can be applied to everything, like the political, what about the economic, the legal, and so on? So in a way, the way we divide up the world, right? If you take a step back, you can only talk about the political because we have different ways of dividing up the world. And usually we say this is political, this is economic, this is legal. There's a history to that division, which we very quickly could get into politics itself, or into economics, or into the legal realm. But if you look at it historically, the world has always been divided up. Aristotle divided it up in one way, very influential. Others have it divided up in other ways, right? So the moment you divide something, what do you do when we divide? Why do we divide up things? I think we divide up things in order to organize stuff, to live, right? To understand that when somebody does something, he or she doesn't do the other thing, right? So you discriminate, you divide up. Now, when you do a distinction, what is a distinction? In some sense, I would argue a distinction is something that you do, you divide up something that naturally is not that division, right? So when I divide up the political from the economic, of course I can then argue, but the economic is also political. Or I can argue the political is also economic, right? Now what I do, and I get to in a second, right? What I do is, I think I don't understand what a distinction is. A distinction means dividing up something that naturally belongs together. Now, when I divide it, there's an advantage to that. I can do certain things with that. And there's a disadvantage because I divided up something that I could also argue belongs together. And a lot of times when we do this discussion, is everything political? Is this political? I think we must be careful not to get confused about what distinctions are for. That doesn't mean that one cannot argue, oh, it should be divided up differently. But I swear you get into the same problematic, right? However you divide up. With distinction comes discrimination. When you don't reflect that, you might fall prey to your own distinctions. Actually, Jacques Derrida, in De la Grammatologie, has this point very clearly in there. You know, the master of deconstructing everything has very well understood that this is what distinctions do. Right? So there's no innocent distinction in one way. But you also couldn't do without. How would you do anything? How would you have found that room if you couldn't distinguish between the 9th and the 8th floor? You would still walking around in 8th floor probably. So it's really interesting to think about distinctions. But I want to get to you, please.
Yeah, I guess I wanted to comment on technically what we're going around with. I do want to respond to what you just said about like what is division and what is the point of division. I believe division is really related to conquering and dominating. So I think I would refer back to Fanon, in which he says the colonial world is a compartmentalized world. And so I do understand the necessity for distinction, but that is very different from division. And I think Arma also speaks to this at length. Aikwe Arma speaks to this at length about the need for division to colonize, to conquer, and to dominate. But to revert back to why I first raised my hand was really like, I think we're going back in circles because first there's this question of, based on what Omar said, like, what is politics? Because Omar, like, it's a presupposition. He said it comes with suffering. So what really are we having considered politics for us to say that it describes these things, he said. And another thing is, like, I think what we're all saying is, like, there's some things that are inherently political. There's some things that are relationally political. There's some things that are politicized. So I think there are differences. I mean, politics exists, but, like, how it exists is very different in all the different things we're talking about. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Very nice, thank you. Yeah, of course. But that was the point. Division can easily be thought of as being an exercise of power. Granted. Whether or not that applies to all division is still a question, right? When I distinguish between the bottle and the microphone, and now I take the bottle to drink from and not the microphone. I'm sure we can get into a discussion how that is political, but we also could have a large argument why that is not political, right? Depending on what we understand by and so on. And we have a long, long tail of assumptions when we talk, right? I like the way you said what is inherently political, if I understood correctly, what is relationally political, and what is politicized. I think that's a nice taxonomy to think through. Right? Of course, there's a lot of metaphysics in there. The distinction between inherent, right, and relational is really a tricky one, right? It's like when I try to understand a characteristic of a thing, and I could say the bottle here is made of plastic. I can understand plastic as a component inherently of the bottle that makes the bottle. But I could also understand the bottle, this bottle, as one that Ralph likes a lot, because it's my bottle, basically, right now, right? And then I have a relational way of defining what the bottle is, right? So there's a lot of metaphysics that come with that. Now, that distinction I understand quite well between inherent and relational. How would you, to ask back, then bring in the politicized? Because that's a notion I wanted to get at, actually. How does that link up with inherent and relational? Can both be politicized? And what is that politicized then? Is it just another way of relational, a subgroup of relational?
Yeah.
Right? How would you conceptualize that?
Definitely. That's why I also want to comment on division, because really nothing in this world is like clearly divided. Many things in this world are clearly divided because relationality also is related to inherent. So that statement of all human beings need water. So the question is, if we are considering what the definition of human beings is, it can be inherent because our context has defined human beings in a certain way. But if I'm looking at it in, like, generally we all agree human beings do need water. So I am politicizing it if I'm saying it in a certain place, in a certain in front of a particular audience, then it's politicized. And then it can be relational, because I was thinking of ethnicity, right? Like how ethnicity can be politicized, but like ethnicity itself can be the basis for political organization. So it can be a relational form. So there is no like clear boundary of how how I view it is there is no clear boundary of how it's going to work. But the point is there are different ways of looking at it.
Thank you so much. I wonder whether relational then is not where we also get into this question of having divided up something and then say, but it's related, right? Which is what a division always does, right? You can argue always both sides. You can emphasize what you think is different and therefore you had reason to divide it, differentiate it, or what was actually making it one thing before you divided it, right? There's both sides to it. And it seems that the discussions that we're having about relationality, which are, by the way, quite dominant discussions in sociology, in some fields, right? It seems that this is complicated there, how to do that. The other thing I had is, it was interesting, I think you know, the point of power with division that comes with division. It's of course one that it's a good example, but also an easy example to say colonialism, right? And then link the power of division that colonialism brought with it. But I would claim even fighting that requires divisions, right? If you take a Marxist standpoint, it's all about division of society, even in an ontological sense, not just an artificial, so a much stronger claim than the one that I said, but there will be a way of saying this society is divided in at least two groups, right? And you believe in that, right? So I don't think thinking would be possible without dividing, right? So you always divide. And then there's a question now, does power only come with colonialism? Is there something specific about that? So we could get into a domain where dividing without politics would be possible? Or is it then just always hegemony versus hegemony? And to link that back, then we are applying an understanding of politics sub specie belli. It's always a fight and a struggle, right? But it's important to know that that this is the presupposition that we are having, that this is how political should be understood, right? By the way, just before I come 1 second, because I of course I should also have mentioned at the beginning, there is in feminism since the 70s the idea of the personal is the political, which is also, it's an interesting reference point because it was a very dominant and is a dominant one in discourse, but it has a very encompassing understanding of politics, because then also everything is possibly political, right? So it's another reference point that we have in the discussion. Now I must see that you and then you, right? And sorry. Thank you. Please. Yeah. You just waved to me. I'm joking. I'm joking. Then let's see. Then it's then I saw your hand. You and you.
Ok,
Please.
merci. En
So-
fait, je voudrais un peu revenir sur la question de la relation, sur la question de ce qu'elle a appelé de l'insécable, ok? De peut-être ce que l'on pourrait appeler avec peut-être glissant, hein, relation, mélange, etc. Mais je crois qu'on doit peut-être repenser un peu cette nécessité de vouloir introduire de la relation entre des choses, alors que ces choses-là ne sont pas peut-être naturellement relationnelles, n'entretiennent pas des relations. Prenons l'exemple, pour revenir un peu à la question de départ entre la connaissance et la politique. Prenons l'exemple de la science et de la technique. La science n'est pas la technique et pourtant la technique n'est pas la science. La technique a précédé la science. L'homme était d'abord, comme le dit Bergson, homo faber avant d'être homo sapiens. Le besoin de vivre, le besoin de s'adapter dans un monde inhospitalier a poussé effectivement l'homme à d'abord être un animal technique avant d'être un scientifique. Et à partir de ce moment, on peut bien dire tout simplement que la science ne mène pas ou bien n'est pas forcément technique. Bien vrai qu'il y a eu effectivement une évolution qui a fait qu'effectivement aujourd'hui, on ne peut plus dissocier, on ne peut plus séparer la science de la technique. Mais originairement, science et technique, effectivement, se distinguent et sont véritablement différentes. C'est dans le même sens que j'inscris effectivement aussi la politique et la connaissance. Je pense que la question devrait plutôt être, est-ce que la connaissance et la technique sont nées, est-ce que la connaissance et la politique sont nées en même temps? Ma réponse est véritablement non. De mon point de vue, la connaissance et la technique n'entretiennent pas forcément une relation indésirable. La politique et la connaissance ne sont pas forcément liées. Bon, en fait, je peux donner un exemple banal. Je dis qu'en fait, peut-être si la politique et la connaissance étaient liées, Socrate ne serait pas condamné à mort. Parce que la condamnation de Socrate, le procès de Socrate, c'était un procès entre la connaissance et la politique. C'est la politique qui a condamné Socrate. Et Socrate voulait effectivement s'opposer avec une politique existante à partir de la philosophie, à partir de la science. Un autre exemple aussi qui montre que la connaissance n'est pas politique, n'est pas forcément politique, c'est effectivement Galilée. Galilée représentait la connaissance, la science. Et l'Église représentait tout simplement la politique. Et la politique a fait condamner tout simplement la connaissance, la science. Toujours par rapport à l'exercice, pour tout simplement dire que nous devons peut-être apprendre un peu à nous défaire de certaines évidences. Il est très évident de dire que non, il n'y a pas de connaissance là où il n'y a pas de politique, il n'y a pas de politique là où il n'y a pas de connaissance, mais si on campe bien les concepts, si on arrive à élucider les concepts et à les clarifier, on verra tout simplement que cette relation-là, que l'on croit que c'est une relation naturelle, inhérente, ne l'est pas forcément. Peut-être ça l'est du point de vue de notre pensée, de notre réflexion. Peut-être que nous réfléchissons de sorte que nous pensons qu'il y a relation, mais au fond, il n'y a pas effectivement pas de relation. Et pour bien comprendre cela, je vous demande de vous référer au rapport d'antériorité qui existe entre la science et la technique, entre la technique et effectivement la science.
Thank you. So we have another example or a proposition for an example, right? For how one could argue like something as being not political. That was the task also, right? So we had the without food people will die, right? This is a different sort of argument that we're hearing, right? Between technique and science. Yeah.
Voilà, que ceux qui doivent faire le test Covid, ceux qui ont reçu le mail de Dominique hier, il est l'heure d'y aller. Munissez-vous de vos passeports, s'il vous plaît. Merci.
Thank you. So let me see where we were, because I want to forget many voices. You're next, and then you. Yeah, please. Yeah.
No, I wanted to, I think now I'm not sure where you were about power, because I wanted to get into the I don't know if I will say divisions or diversity or how to say it. But for example, I just want to give an example. In my culture where I come from, we have different clan names. People belong in different clan names. Of course, when you historicize this, you'll find out everyone is related to the other. But if these ones are Black Panthers and we are lions and they are water, they live in under the same community, we can have a ceremony. The Black Panthers can have a ceremony. It's about their healing, what they are struggling with as a family. We might not even know what they are struggling with, and but because we are living in community, there's a responsibility as community that when they having something, we should go and assist. So we are going to assist, fetch water, fetch wood, and on all the things that they need to make it possible for their healing. But on the day of the healing, all of us take a step back, and leave them to do their business. But so I don't know whether that's diversity. You understand? I am still, for example, if I'm water, I'm still a water coming from the water clan name, but living in a community with people who are Black Panthers, who are lions, but we live in communal. And that doesn't make us fight, let's say, to go to you and say, be a Black Panther like me, you understand? In fact, so for me, it boils down to the question of power when we are talking, perhaps, I don't know whether we say divisions or diversity. Because even within this context, there will be a ceremony where they say, lions are uncles of the Black Panthers, so they are allowed now to come in the ceremony and be present. So there's opening up. So for me, I think also in that divisions, I don't know if I say diversity, it's also about a question of power and how you view each other, in terms of being or something.
Yeah, thank you so much. There's a. Let me get the two voices quickly. Yeah. We soon have a break, I heard. But yeah, I think there's also there's the whole discipline of social epistemology out there, right, which would question such topics about groups, right? What it is about beliefs that groups might hold. So I think it's not wrong probably to think that there might be something like knowledge that is constricted to a group, right? But even if you have a ceremony about water or anything like that, right, that would probably not make the statement all humans need water or without water you die no longer knowledge or not true, right? I think we're just adding to that now, and then we get into a realm that is much easier political. I'm not sure that political is the right word, but you're going to a pluralist at least notion of knowledge, and then one always verges on the relativistic, right? So because some knowledge that you would consider a group holds might be not true for another group to hold, right? If that is so, and we would come to an issue about whether water is required for human beings to survive, right? I think we would be hard to say, it's just true for one group, but not for the other. Let's try with the group that doesn't have any water, right? So I think we still have forms of knowledge, right? And the question whether all knowledge is political should at least, I think, divide up between which form of knowledge do we talk about. And then there might be a more, in some.
Power comes in because we assume that already the Black Panthers, the reason why they have their gatherings, their ceremonies, the way they do it, it's because they understand knowledge is political. So they need to gather as the Panthers, you understand. But therefore, the fact that that community can respect them, to do that, there is an understanding that knowledge is already political, and how in that family knows the world and knows is different from my family,
Right.
how it knows the world. But we allow ourselves a space to know the way we know, and then the spaces where we meet.
But aren't we now discussing what constitutes knowledge? What is the body of knowledge that in a certain group is accepted as being knowledge, right? Now, very quickly then we're in politics, right? And that's where colonialism is a wonderful example in many ways, right? Because it said this is knowledge, this is not knowledge. But did it make the knowledge somehow not being knowledge because it was used politically? So that borderline I'm still interested in. Isn't it so that we have things that you could argue, they're just not political, but if I use them in a certain way, if I tell you, for instance, this is knowledge that you should know, right? Or this is knowledge that you have to know, and I walk around the place here, now it's political, now it's power, right? But is it power at the beginning? Is 1 + 1 = 2 in the beginning political? Or is it that it is the basis now? You could count differently, right? It's easy to imagine mathematically that 1 + 1 = 4 or something like that. But we all have the same base in mathematics, right? Why is that so? I think there's politics behind there, and you could tell a history, you could write a history about how it came that today we all accept 1 + 1 = 2. But does that mean that if we agree on the base of mathematics that 1 + 1 = 2, that is somehow not knowledge? So isn't there two spheres? One about which is true knowledge, if you accept certain conditions, but that's not me knowing about the mathematicians and natural scientists and so on. And then there's a way of how everything could be made political. So I'm still interested in the politicization issue, right? And I wonder whether it would not help our discussions if we grant that there's spheres out there, they don't want to be political. And it would be disastrous for natural scientists if they try to mend climate change, right, which is clearly a political issue in many ways, but if it's for certain people who try to get at the problem, if they sit there and think constantly, oh, but I'm doing politics, right? I'm not sure where we will get there, where we want to be. So sometimes it's also important sociologically, I think, to isolate realms and say they don't have to think about politics. That's why at the beginning I said, who is asking the question? Now we have a group in here, I think, from the disciplines, right? More social sciences, humanities, right? I think this discussion will be very different with natural scientists, right? And of course, it's important that political scientists, ethnologists, sociologists think about how natural scientists are political when they do what they do. That's important, right? So it's much harder for us to accept that there should be a realm that is not predominantly interested in whether that's political when I try to maybe make sure that climate change doesn't affect us the way it might or does, right? So this distinction, I think, is very important when we come up with questions like, is all political knowledge and we all feel we know? Yes, of course it is. As you all emphasize, experience, background, right? It must also be your way of looking at the world, the disciplines that make you answer that very easily and quickly. Yes, of course it is. But I think that must be really just too quick, right? I would love to have an answer to how political is knowledge which says, oh, if I understand this, if I look at that for this problematic, yes, it is, and I will argue for that. But I always would want to be free to say, oh, if I do this and this with it, no, of course not, right? And if I assume that the world is about natural relations, as you made an argument, right? For some people, some disciplines, I think it's absolutely fair to think natural relations, they exist. That's what I do with it. From a political theory point of view, there's just no such thing as natural relations, right? Because you see power everywhere and so on. But I think it's really a question of humility not to think that what oneself is doing is what everybody should be doing, right? That's very imperialistic, right? So we must have, I think, a society in which people do different things, we check on each other, right? But that does mean also we should be careful in saying everything's political. What are we actually saying? But is that what natural scientists should be concerned about always? Doesn't mean they should have a good seminar on the question, right? Now I'm seeing some hands, but I was also told by Elisa we should do a break. So I would suggest that we do a break, and then I remembered you have a question, right? You have a question, and I just saw a hand there. So I will remember the three of you, and we continue after the break. And then I also want to put up some quotes by Boaventura de Sousa Santos, just to give you an example of a concrete, very influential decolonial thinker. And then we can see from what we discussed this morning, how can we discuss these quotes, right? And hopefully learn something about what he's saying, so we understand what he's actually saying. So when we would want to criticize him, we know what we criticize him for, right? But I need a coffee, definitely. Sorry. So let's have a break.
had to go and have their COVID test done, and we had not been informed that that had been planned. Otherwise, we might have a different way. And some have had to go to the bank, and we don't know when they will be back. And it's the last day, and and some of us are leaving tonight. So we are going to continue, even without some of the colleagues, and we will see. I mean, we hope that they will come back early enough to profit from the discussions, and of course to contribute to the discussions. So let's just carry on. And I mean, at 1 o'clock we will have our lunch break. And well, we will see how far we go. Okay.
Very good, thank you. I think we have a wonderful group of people here. So let's use this group, right? I also was asked not only to speak more slowly, but also to remind everyone that when you speak, please speak into the microphone. Right? Because sometimes you look at other people and then it's hard for the translators to understand. I think what we will do until hopefully some of the other participants return is continue the discussion a little bit. There were some people who had statements who are still waiting for that. And I think we start with that. And also my colleague, Professor Ndiaye, would want to contribute, I promised, right? So we have, I think, 4 people, and I would give you first actually the voice. And then my recollection was, you wanted to say something? You wanted to say something? And there was somebody at the back there. But maybe no longer here, we'll see. We'll have a discussion continuing the question of the morning, and when the others return, I want to put up some slides again with the example that I brought with me, Boaventura de Sousa Santos, and some statements of his. But please, first, I would like to give the word to you. Après? Okay. So I think you're next.
Sorry, mine was just a comment, right? As you've been speaking about the political and whatnot, right? So I'm going to piggyback my comment. I'm piggybacking on Machi's statement when she spoke about the political being relational, and for me, I thought what's very important, maybe what I think we are missing here a little bit, is that as soon as we touch on the realm of the relational being the political, we tap into the realm of ethics itself. Ethics itself, especially as it relates to human beings. I know the questions, there were comments about animals and other things, but especially on human beings, that the ethical becomes also very important as it relates to the political. You cannot, the two are not separated. Sorry, it was just a comment, a very short comment from my side I want to make.
No, thank you so much. It's an important point. It's an important point. I think, when I said, isn't everything also economic? Isn't everything also legal? The ethical could have been very easily in there. Right? There's a lot of discussion in sociology whether when you divide up the world, right, what division can you make? And traditionally, especially in liberal theory, the idea was that the political would be a realm by program, or you might do evil stuff, right? So that's really the place of ethics is a really important one. So I'm glad you brought that up. I think it is. I'm still struggling a bit with that point about a relational understanding of politics and how that links up with dividing different spheres, right? Dividing different spheres, because in order to be relational, you must distinguish politics from other spheres, right? Or entities must be some political, some not political. Positionality often brings in these other domains and says, no, understanding of politics would look more at how things are interdependent, how things are related to each other, right? But are they all political?
No, I absolutely agree with that. So as much as I was piggybacking on my comments in here, I also don't think like they are separate itself. For me, it's very interesting in a sense that science itself, there's been people in the, when I say science, I use the word in inverted commas, in physics, who have come to this realization. I don't know if you're familiar with David Bohm's work, that the problem precisely is fragmentation. So even with studying minute particles, that the observer is the observed. By the way they look at things, they have an impact on whatever they're studying and looking at it by your mere presence. Sorry, I don't know if I make sense, but yeah.
No, that makes sense. Yeah, I mean, it's the point that in natural science, they come to understand that the way you observe something actually changes the thing, right? So there's this discussion about that, yeah. It is a complicated dimension there, and then what effect that has and how that effect would enter the level of politics, right? It still could be an effect that is good to know about, but we could still argue for and against whether that has anything to do with politics, right? And then we would get, I think, into very similar discussions about, is it the context that is now making it political or the thing in itself? I would still, and I would actually argue that case and try to defend it, that a statement like 1 + 1 = 2 is not political, right? But I would also argue I can make it political in an instance. But now I'm attaching a perspective to it, I'm attaching a problematic to it that it does not necessarily have to be in. Because it doesn't have to be necessarily in that context, right? It's not political in itself. Now, that might not be interesting for our concerns when it is about how can we have less inundation in the streets of means, right? Maybe that's just not the concern there. But in itself, I think it's important to always argue that not everything is political, I would say. Because then to say that something is political has actual value. You're actually saying something now. You're discriminating, and that can be helpful, right? Maybe coming with a lot of problems. But that's why I would insist on distinguishing in the end. And I also think that if we think about it this way, it might help us to be more precise what we're actually meaning when we say this is political or that is political. And that means in practice, you might have a better impact. You might actually move things around. If it becomes like a knee-jerk reaction to say everything's political, everything's Eurocentric, everything is this or that, I just fear that we're missing out on impact about the things that we're really concerned about, right? So I think that's what is up to this for discussion also. It's just the way I would argue. Yeah. I think to you, yeah.
Bonjour professeur, merci. Bon, je me présente à vous également. Je suis Gare Joël Fabrice, doctorant en sociologie à l'Université Félix Houphouët-Boigny d'Abidjan. Aurélie et moi, on a eu à travailler sur un sujet qui, on va dire, est une continuité de notre exercice d'hier soir. Cependant, pour certains soucis de compréhension, on n'a pas voulu directement aborder de l'aspect de la surpolitisation des mesures gouvernementales de santé publique auprès des communautés virtuelles Facebook en Côte d'Ivoire. On a juste limité le thème aux mesures de santé publique en Côte d'Ivoire. Et dans notre argumentaire, on voulait démontrer que la connaissance peut être neutre, donc pas nécessairement politique, et politique dans la mesure où elle est intégrée dans un contexte qui est différent. Je m'explique. En Côte d'Ivoire, les mesures de santé publique au départ de la maladie ont été axées, sinon ancrées dans des données probantes de santé publique, avec un relevé quotidien de nombre de cas qui a justifié, par exemple, le fait qu'on veuille séparer Abidjan, sinon le grand Abidjan, du reste du pays pour éviter une contamination, donc briser la chaîne de la propagation de la maladie. Cependant, lorsque le contexte électoral s'amplifiait, les mesures gouvernementales de santé publique ont tout de suite été ramenées à ce contexte-là. Et il y a eu un parallèle qui a fait que ces mêmes mesures, initialement, qui n'étaient pas discutées comme étant politiques, donc qui n'avaient pas d'idées sous-jacentes avec la politique, ont tout de suite été ramenées à la politique. En soi, la maladie n'était pas discutée. les mesures de santé publique n'étaient pas discutées. C'était plutôt les motivations, sinon les raisons qui légitimaient la mise en place de ces politiques qui étaient discutées. Donc ici, l'imbrication du politique aux mesures gouvernementales de santé publique qui ont été appliquées. Au-delà de cela, ceux qui disaient ouvertement que ces mesures de santé publique étaient politisées se justifiaient de la sorte. Il y a eu plusieurs parallèles entre certaines manifestations politiques et des mesures qui ont été prises. Il y a eu par exemple une duplication des mesures de santé publique du nord vers le sud qui ont été également instaurées. Donc, on se base sur cet argumentaire pour dire qu'initialement, la connaissance qui a été mise à disposition de la santé publique pour contenir la maladie n'était pas en soi politique. Mais compte tenu de l'évolution du contexte qui a suivi, il y a eu une politisation et par la suite une amplification des débats autour de ces mesures de santé publique-là. Donc ici, une imbrication de la connaissance à la politique que nous avons tenté d'exprimer. Merci.
Thank you very much. There was a lot in there. And one thing that we haven't mentioned is, of course, a very dominant understanding that as soon as the state is involved, it's political, right? So something is political because you have a presence of the state. It's a very dominant understanding that I haven't mentioned yet, right? The other thing that I noticed from what you were saying is there's also an important distinction whether when we ask what is political, what not, whether we're talking at the language of the research object. That means because you said something was not considered political, wasn't discussed as being political, right? So whether something is discussed as political or not, that's on the level of the research object. So we look at it and then we say, they've called COVID a political issue or not, right? So it's what we examine. Now it's a different thing whether I call it political or not, the research subject. And research object, difficult. It's one of these distinctions that you can quickly problematize, but there's also benefit to it, right? And I think we need to be careful to always understand at which level we're operating. And it's hard because it's the same word, right? And we often have that in research. We use the same word, but sometimes at the level of what we're looking at, our research objects, and sometimes it's our term to say what we are seeing there. So I can say this about politics, about political, even without nobody using the term, right? So these two levels are always very important, I find. Complicated, but important to distinguish, right? And also, I think you from what you said, it wasn't political. And then you said the evolution of the context, right? And it became political. So we're in a similar state of affairs that we were in the morning, where something is not political, then it is political. And that reminded me, of the three levels that your colleague nicely put in about inherent, something that is inherently political, something that is relationally political, and something that is politicized. And I asked her, how do you put politicized in there? But one distinction that is important, I think, is if we say something is politicized, what are we saying? We're admitting, and it's a presupposition of that sentence, that something was not political, right? So obviously there must be some things that we think of in certain contexts as not political. Then politicization comes in, and now it's political. That's what the term means, to politicize something. Not political before, yes, afterwards. It's important for our discussions, right? Because we're still trying to find examples, right, of something that we can confidently say, not political. If we use the language of politicization, we admitted to that, I think. That's interesting, because I would think that one of the results of this morning that I was hoping for maybe to come to discuss is maybe when we ask, is all knowledge political? Maybe there's good reason to be skeptical. But I think I would always go along with the statement, all knowledge can be politicized. That I find is a solid one to argue for, right? But it's a difference there between all knowledge is political and all knowledge can be politicized, right? And I think that's something maybe that we want to carry away from. If you agree and if you don't agree, then it will be interesting to refine it further, right? Please.
Thank you. Thank you. I think that we should always bear in mind who's speaking, because from the point of view of where one stands, one will either assert that something is political or not political. And even that assertion is a political assertion. And so who decide what is political and who decides what is not political? And on that basis, how are they being political by so saying? So to take your example of 1 + 1 equals to 2, is inherently, even the idea of something being inherent does not take into consideration that, again, the idea of inherent is not universal. So 1 + 1 is 2, possibly not political, because it's supposed to be a matter of fact statement. But even this matter of fact is an assertion of a homogeneous way of looking at the world. For the fact that 1 + 1 is 2 does stand on a particular historicity and necessarily precludes other ways of engaging with the world. Because other people may actually say 1 + 1 is everything. And for them, that is objective, because that's where they are located and that's what they want to assert. So to say something is political, I think is political in itself. Number one is the point that I'm making. And number two, that it also depends on who is asserting and what interest are they being political about. And also to also say that we are that point that Lerato was making about division and diversity. I was listening to your language. You were saying, if you divide the world, so you have the power to divide the world, which means that somebody else might not necessarily have the power to divide the world. And perhaps to piggyback on what she was saying, the division, perhaps maybe a power over kind of thing, vis-a-vis perhaps a diversity, as she was explaining, a diversity that perhaps might be a power too. So is politics always, does politics always imply power? I don't know. I don't know, but also I wanted to say this morning's exercise for me really made me feel like, when they say the devil, the devil is in the detail. The devil is the devil is in the detail. I wrote a paper actually many years ago when I was still viable to say that in fact the detail is the devil, because on one hand one has an experience of the world, and from their experience of the world they want to assert that something is political. And then we do this thing of saying this is political, this is not political. We go into the detail, and it becomes the devil, because all of a sudden you knew, and all of a sudden you don't, because the devil has intervened just there. An example from South Africa, where there are those of us who spend so much of our time in white spaces. And all the time we are supposed to do this, is it politics? Is it not politics? Is it politics? Is it not politics? And you have to find a way of justifying why it is politics or not, using a framework that belongs to the university. And when you get home, the people at home know that it's politics. They don't know anything about Schmid or anything, but they know that it's politics. And for them, that's it. It's politics. So the being in the university may actually, and our idea of knowledge may actually take away from knowing. We know. We don't need knowledge. We don't need a precondition, that is defined by somebody else. But now if we don't meet that precondition, all of a sudden what we know becomes a nonsense. And like all of us who are in the university and are trying to be outside of university are always floating. And somehow you have to find the language, and the language is not there. Precisely because this is a political game. It is a political game.
Thank you so much. Yeah,
Thank
yeah. There's a
you.
lot in there of what you said. Let me try to say something, and then. But there's a lot in there, and I agree actually with a lot. I think a lot of it we have also alluded to in the morning, right? I think because you brought the example from South Africa, right? I'm probably okay to say Saint Augustine. He has this famous saying, right? I always knew what time was until I started thinking about it. Now I no longer know what time is. That's maybe this tension, right? So, but it also means a distinction between practical knowledge and theoretical knowledge. Practical knowledge is I know how to open the door, right? But if I'm nervous and I think too much about it, I mess up maybe, right? So there's all levels of practical, and I try to theorize what does it mean to open a door. Philosophically, I could quickly problematize, right, this thing, and then we don't know, right? So I get that. But also I'm not sure whether practical knowledge is just what we want to settle for and say that's enough, that's good enough. Because there's an inherent link, I think, between practical knowledge and populism, between practical knowledge and this and that. So I think we still need to theorize, right? Even if there's problems in there. And the other thing that I noticed that I think is interesting maybe is when you said, you started off with positionality. So you said it's always from a certain position that we say this is political or this is not political, and we need to reflect that. I agree, but when you then at the same moment say, so even that assertion is political, right? Then that assertion also is conditioned by the positionality from who says it, right? So that makes it difficult. Now, if we follow the positionality argument to its logical end, not sure whether we can talk to each other, right? So there's a limit of positionality. So when you want to convince me, as I think you tried, that everything's political, then I can quickly say, yes, but that's your positionality. So when does positionality become an immunization argument? An argument that immunizes me from criticism, right? I think that's a really important question, because positionality can be powerful to use. And it might be right to use, I agree, but it cannot be the last word in this discussion, I think.
Given the history of the world, are some people not immune to the same standard of critique? Because if we are saying that can the subaltern speak, then it means something has already been defined as speech. And the subaltern may speak all they want, but it does not translate to actual speech, because speaking is already defined. So the idea that there's theory and there's practice is in itself a way of seeing the world. It is, and to say that one is superior to another, it's yet another way of seeing the world, which does not apply to everyone, I don't think.
One might argue that, But that same argument has to apply what you're just saying, right? If you really believe in that, then that's not a final argument, because it's just the positionality from which you're speaking. Isn't that a large way of the decolonial point, right? It's Walter Mignolo, it's others. You speak from where you feel, and so on, right? So if that is taken very radically, and then it becomes a view of the world itself that you just tell me rightly, I think, needs to be understood against the positionality from which it is uttered, right? So it's hard then to come to something that we can actually discuss about. That's what I'm not worried. I think positionality is really important, and I don't disagree with your points, right? For me, there's a philosophical problem there, right? Because it seems to lead into some sort of relativism, and that I think is not where you want to end up with. Now, you may also not want to end up with, at the other end, unqualified, unabashed universalism, right? So I think most of us are somewhere interested in the middle, in the middle where we can acknowledge that there's hegemony in how to view the world, right? Hegemony in which words are used to describe the world. All of that I agree. But I'm philosophically, I would even say, by virtue of us having different positionalities. So positionality, I've come to think, I think is always both at the same time. It's enabling, gives you access, and it's constraining, because now you see a certain thing in some way that it would be good for you to see in another way, right, at the same time. That's where criticality comes in, right? To be critical means maybe something like, I can see something now in different ways. I understand the limits of my seeing it this way. Right? So positionality really, I think, is a powerful tool, but it's both enabling and constraining at the same time. And that's our challenge when we speak, maybe. But I see that the points that you make, and I'm not on the other end there, I think. But I wanted to also, I'm sorry, please.
Je pense que je ne serai pas long. Moi, je voulais juste revenir sur l'exemple de départ par rapport à la bouteille d'eau, quand on disait j'ai bu de l'eau. Quand je dis j'ai bu de l'eau, il n'y a rien de politique derrière. Juste pour dire que rien n'est politique. Tout peut le devenir, par contre. Dès que je commence à me poser des questions, comme elle disait tout à l'heure, le diable est dans les détails. La politique, ou plutôt le domaine même du politique, on va dire, est dans les détails. Dès que je commence à interroger avec quoi j'ai bu du plastique, est-ce que c'est recyclable? On commence à politiser la chose. On rentre dans un processus et on interroge l'espace de prise de décision. À partir de ce moment, en fait, on parle de politisation et à la fin, effectivement, le fait de boire de l'eau devient politique. Tout simplement. C'est très simple, je bois de l'eau, on ne m'interroge pas sur avec quoi j'ai bu et si c'est recyclable ou non, c'était simple, c'est pas politique. Mais dès que je rentre dans comment et qu'est-ce qui fait que je m'interroge, donc on est dans l'interrogation, on continue dans l'interrogation. C'est par exemple quand il parlait tout à l'heure, Joël, de la question du Covid. Si je dis j'ai eu le Covid-19, c'est moi, je l'ai eu. Il n'y a rien de politique derrière. Dès que je commence à interroger qui l'a eu et comment ça a été traité, là, ça devient politique. Il y a une prise de décision, une prise en charge, on va dire. Une prise en charge de qui? De l'État. Et dès que l'État rentre en jeu, il y a le pouvoir politique qui rentre en jeu. Ce n'est plus un rapport de pouvoir entre toi et moi, peut-être, mais c'est l'État qui prend les choses en main. Et donc, c'est vraiment un processus de politisation dans lequel on se trouve. Et vraiment, je voulais attirer l'attention par rapport à cela pour dire qu'on peut dire que rien n'est politique, par contre, tout peut devenir politique. Et le professeur avait raison tout à l'heure de dire par rapport à l'éthique, par rapport au droit, par rapport à qu'est-ce qui est juridique, qu'est-ce qui ne l'est pas. Tout peut le devenir, mais à force de s'interroger, on en revient à ce qui nous intéresse, en fait.
S'il vous plaît, madame.
Oui.
Oui, vous avez parfaitement raison. Maintenant, je me pose une question. Qui légifère la connaissance? Et celui qui légifère la connaissance, si c'est sur un point de vue social, qui veut dire gouverner, gouverner veut dire raison d'entendement, parce qu'on doit se mettre d'accord. Parce que Oui, pour gouverner, il y a une raison d'entendement, on doit se mettre d'accord. C'est celui qui a dit que c'est Covid. Là encore, on se questionne. Lui qui a légiféré, qui nous a dit que c'est Covid, c'était dans quel espace? Pour quelle raison? Est-ce que c'était politique ou non? Moi, je pense que la question, elle est perpétuelle, au fait. il y a juste plusieurs ramifications où on peut s'atteler pour chercher à comprendre. Parce qu'après, avant que ça soit Covid, il y a quelqu'un qui a légiféré cette connaissance. Pourquoi? Sous quel but?
C'est pas pour rien. Je pense qu'on a des collèges, des laboratoires, etc. Si on en est venu au paludisme, au Covid, etc., c'est parce qu'en fait, il y a vraiment comment ça s'appelle, des entreprises qui sont à même, des structures qui sont à même, en fait, de valider cette connaissance-là.
D'accord.
Et maintenant, pour, en fait, valider la connaissance et en faire une maladie, la COVID-19 ou le COVID-19, et en faire une pandémie, par exemple, là, c'est autre chose. Le phénomène pandémique rentre dans le politique.
Oui, madame, je suis d'accord. Je prends d'abord avant que ça soit pandémie, pour que ça soit appelé COVID-19.
Oui.
Pourquoi ce n'était pas une grippe ordinaire comme avant? Pourquoi on nous a extrapolé, mis dans la tête que c'était aussi grave, aussi l'autre là? Pourquoi ce n'était pas une grippe ordinaire où pendant des saisons d'harmattan on subissait? Pourquoi on l'appelait Covid? Est-ce que ce n'était pas politique? Je prends l'exemple de l'eau. Ma grand-mère qui est au village, quand elle prend l'eau de la rivière, de la source, on dit d'accord, l'eau est potable, c'est bon. Mais moi qui suis né en ville, qui est allé à l'école, on me dit c'est pas potable. On me dit c'est l'eau là qui est bonne. Pourquoi? Je bois de l'eau, oui, mais pourquoi on me dit que c'est cette eau? Pourquoi je ne peux plus boire l'eau de ma rivière calmement? Parce qu'on a inclus en moi que même l'eau de la rivière n'est plus l'eau. Donc, ça, sur le côté social, parce que c'est gouverner, raison d'entendement, ça pose problème, ça nous pose toujours des questions de manière perpétuelle. Après, même la science, celui qui nous a dit que la Terre était ronde, d'accord, mais lui, il a voulu légiférer, nous dire, est-ce que c'était vrai? C'est lui qui nous a dit, même la science au début, moi, je me pose la question, qui légifère la connaissance, qui rend la connaissance universelle? Est-ce que c'est pas pour prendre position, vouloir se faire connaître? Je pense que... Merci.
C'est bon? Allez-y.
Merci, Rech. En fait, je voudrais un peu revenir là-dessus. Pour tenter de répondre à ta question, je pourrais dire que c'est par rapport à un référentiel. Tu vois, je suis catholique, mais je vais vous dire quelque chose qui peut-être va vous choquer. Lorsqu'on dit comme cela que l'ange du Seigneur a apparu à la Vierge Marie, on le croit. Mais sur moi, je vous dis que ma grand-mère m'est apparue en rêve hier nuit. On doutera de moi. C'est blanc parce qu'on a un référentiel ici, on a un canon qui est là, comme le professeur a eu à le dire le premier jour. Et c'est autour de ce canon-là que notre argumentaire, nos réflexions et tout sont basés. Donc moi, pour juste répondre à ta question, c'est le canon, c'est le référentiel de départ.
Bon, je suis d'accord. Là, il faut que je sois catholique pour accepter l'ange. Si je suis animiste, je ne connais pas l'ange.
D'où le référentiel dont je fais part.
It's very good that you have so much energy after 1 week to still do that. Really admire that. To show contingency in history could have been otherwise. And why it was that way and not the other way? Power, often. That's what critical scholars do when they do a genealogy. So every history can be turned into a genealogy, like something like the history of triangles, right? A triangle seems to be a definitional thing. We all know how to define a triangle. It's axiomatic. It is only what it is when it is done the way that mathematics tells us to do. Axiomatic knowledge. Now, if you say all is political, at that point you already would say that axiomatic way of defining knowledge is political. That's where I think, I'm not so sure whether we need to go that way. Now, if I tell a history of triangles, right, very quickly it's becoming political, understand, right? But now we're adding this context to it again. Now we might be interested in that, right? Then when we talk the example of climate change, complicated issue. Whether I'm willing to follow you in saying, I just validate it myself, right? There's some issues where I would feel I'm not in a position to validate. If it's about knowledge, is there a rhino in this room right now or not? I'm sure we could try to validate it by ourselves. Sense perception, right? I don't see a rhino. Now I cannot know a positive, right? Because it might be hiding under the table, right? I'd have to check everywhere and so on. No? It's a famous example in philosophy. But still, I would be able, I think, to validate it myself. So how do we validate knowledge in the true justified belief, the justification part, right? Now, some sort of justification is by common knowledge. How do I know that Dakar is the capital city of Senegal? How would you know such a thing other than by having learned it from an atlas or by some authority? Highly questionable, politics quickly in there, right? But if I'm not going down the way of learning justification, non-political, maybe there's a space for two statements at the same time, right? Might not be a contradiction because we're really answering different questions then, right? So, I agree with what you said now. Please.
Thank you for the opportunity. I think that a bit of my discomfort comes from the view that positionality then locks us off to criticality and the lack of criticality. But at the bottom of it all, I think what we are trying to agitate for is that there is a particular way of being in the world. There are particular structures, as you've said, the structures that you are born to, the conventional, the institutionalization. And what we're agitating for is a deeper understanding of those particular structures and what informs those structures and who they serve in a way in which to be able to then argue or posit about knowledge and the politicization of knowledge or it being political. I think the agitation here is this definition of knowledge. Where is this knowledge? Who has contrived that this is knowledge? How is this knowledge then being institutionalized? And who then does it serve? Because I believe that positionality then assists us in understanding or being able to dismantle, or not necessarily dismantle because that might not be the word, but to be able to start critically engaging with the structures that exist, and in our understanding of what knowledge is and how knowledge has been constructed, we then are able to speak to, whether it is political or not. So I do feel that I am a bit, there's a bit of discomfort around, positionality being put against criticality, because I think they are not mutually exhaustive and they can live together. But I do believe that what we are agitating for is a more holistic understanding of these constructs of knowledge and how we then come into existing in the world in a way that we are better able to understand the formation of that knowledge. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'm not sure whether there's a misunderstanding about positionality and criticality. I didn't try to put them as opposed to each other. But what I try to say is enabling and constraining at the same time, right? So I would think positionality enables criticism, but it's also constraining it. It's both at the same time. So I'm not putting them opposite each other so neatly, I would say, right? I agree with, I'm not quite sure whether what we are agitating for, what that means, right? Because who's the we here then, right? And this agitation, what does that mean? But I know where the language comes from, right? But I'm not sure whether we can agree that that is the common goal, that we should agitate for things. But it's just maybe a different language that I would use there. I just have a point about, I think you're right about particular ways of being, right? While the devil is in the detail, right? I'm not quite sure, are these ways of being in the world individual? Are they constrained to groups? Identity groups? Is it possible to have multiple identities And that would constrain you then to a particular way of being in the world. Not because you're a member of this group, but you're a member of this group, that group, this group, that group, and the overlap gives you that particular way of being in the world. And isn't it so that we have some certain things in life where there might be shared ways of being in the world? When I took the plane to come here, I can go to any airport, right? Some things are very similar, others not, and we can problematize that, right? But isn't it a sort of a way of being in the world today, and maybe always, was always a multi-layered, like a complicated thing, right? Individual to some extent in the end. So you have your way of being in the world. Also shared in many ways at a local level, at an interconnecting level, maybe even at a global level in some sense, right? So what I fear a bit, to call the elephant in the room, right? Whether in decolonial theory, particular groups are not heavily emphasized to a degree that makes a particular way of being in the world just a feature of you being part of that group or that group. I'm part of many groups, right? Whether I want or not. Right? And I think that this sort of multiple identities is a term that I think is important in that regard, right? You don't have to be confined to being part of a group. A lot of it is not your choice, right? So there's a lot of questions still that I have, but I can see the discomfort that you have. I understand it's a valid discomfort. I mean, I can see why that is something to put up. Yeah, please.
Perhaps a question to you. How then do you understand coloniality? What are some of the defining features of coloniality? To the extent then that we can get to the question of whether there's a particular way of being in the world. So my mind is not very steady at this point, but the point that you were making, oh yes, I wanted to say, are you de-emphasizing the historicity of race in particular being a primary organizing principle, that then whatever other places of belonging that one may experientially belong to do issue from this mover of first and last instance in so many ways in this particular epoch that we are living through. So I think I have two questions. What are the basics of what has been called coloniality, to the extent then that we can then begin to, say, is there a particular way of being in the world? And number two, what of race as a concrete and a historical and experiential primary organizing principle that then we come to experience the world? Thank you.
Thank you so much. What a brilliant question. It's a big one. It's a big one, I think. It's Friday. Friday is for big questions, right? So we can recover Saturday and Sunday. Very good. Yeah. Yeah. No, it's a big one. But personally, my take would be, right, that coloniality, as the term suggests, is a condition, right? And then you have colonialism, which is a historical phenomenon that we tell that there's good ground to say has not ended, and we have all the post-colonial discussion therefore, right? But it's also, we're telling histories about it, And we want to be careful about what history are we telling, right? In history nowadays, we are careful in thinking, oh, we are telling how it really was. So we spin narratives around it, right? And there has been a history of colonialism that the colonizers have told. And I think we've become good at deconstructing that, showing power relations that went in there, right? So for me, the critical question would be, how do the histories of colonialism that we tell, that we think are better than the, hopefully, than the ones that the colonizers told, right? How do they also express power relations? How do they also, we can't escape that, right? So the progressive critical question is, where do we fall into the next pitfall, right? What will people in 50 years criticize about us? And I think there's ample room to fall into pitfalls. There's not just a right history about colonialism. That's not relativizing it in any way. Right? Colonialism, I think, would be difficult, right, to save, right, in any ways, and we shouldn't want to. But my point, I cannot save the historical phenomenon for what it was, but I can help maybe tell a better history about it, improve on the history, understand power relations that went in there. So we need a lot of research on that. And I think this is an area that actually a lot of people in universities are interested in. So that's good. Nothing wrong with it, right? I think we should put a lot of brain power into trying to get better and better at telling histories, but there's no right history in the end, right? We can say what we don't. The histories that we reject is easier. So the colonizers' history of colonialism, we don't need to read anymore, other than for looking at presuppositions and things like that. I'll get back to you in a second. But I also think that colonialism and coloniality as a condition is one of the dominant ways of looking at the world today. It's not the only one, I think. There's gender, there's class, right? Sometimes we had interesting fights between post-colonials and Marxists, for instance. Vivek Chibber, in a very provocative book, goes at the post-colonials and says, "Oh, you Dipesh Chakrabarti, right? You tell us about the tea house in India, right? How and how you hold the cup actually shows a protest, right? And it becomes very sophisticated, and then that's subversion, protest, and so on." And he says, basically, you just don't see that this is a very oppressive scheme of things, simply, right? It's about class at that point. It's a Marxist way that will explain much more. And because you focus of going against it, you don't see the power anymore. So class, and I think, is just another one out there. Now we all have these discussions about intersectionality, where you try to look at time, and I think that's valuable, right? That's a good discussion to have. But is a problem if you just put that all in a package, and colonialism becomes the same, or coloniality becomes the same sort of condition as class and gender. I think then one goes very big and one loses out maybe in I'm afraid, right? So I that's how I look at coloniality as an important thing to do for universities, for societies, right? We're still busy looking at our histories. How did Switzerland engage in colonialism? There's many ways, even as a non-colonial power, how we were involved in colonialism. And Switzerland, for what I know, has in the last 20 years discussed that topic up and down. And we know so much more now about how it was involved in colonialism. There's so much more to do, right, in this sense, and we want to understand better. But it's just one thing, I find, right? So I'm personally very much involved in looking at Marxism and class and this sort of things, right? But it's another way to look at it. They don't go together so easily as sometimes decolonial scholars make them go together. I'm skeptical of that, right? I think it's actually better if one person looks at this, one person loses this perspective or this lens, right? And then we can position ourselves. But it's, in my view, not one big phenomenon where we just know how to look at things. I think that's too quick. But you might want to disagree, I see.
I think the question I was asking was not about history or anything like that. I was saying the founding blocks of what then gave us the world like we know it today I don't have a way of asking, but I'm driving towards this idea of whether there are people who think of the world as interconnected, such that phenomena cannot be fragmented. There are people who think of phenomena as necessarily fragmented. There are people who think of things as linear and therefore necessarily introduce power over. There are people who think of things as complementary and therefore would rather think of secularity as mutually enabling. There are people who are saying there's power in diversity, and then there are people like Ndlovukateni is saying who subscribe by the paradigm of one. There shall be one this, there shall be one state, there shall be one people, there shall be one gender, there shall be one, and therefore is necessarily working against the pluri way of being. So for me, the tension is there to say that the world that we live in now would like for us to think that theory is necessarily divorced from practice, and somehow theory is theory, however it's conceptualized, is better than practical knowledge. A world that says that water that is drawn from the rivers is necessarily of inferior quality than water that perhaps is packaged, and things like that, that I think really are the nub, I think are the nub of the contention that has really defined this epoch that we are living in. So I was not so much asking about historicity and things like that, but I was just saying that there are ways of being in the world that even as we are talking here, I'm beginning to decipher. So.
Yeah, thank you so much. I'm sorry if I misunderstood, but I think I cannot answer that question without historicity, I'm afraid. I think it just matters, right? It matters. And, you know, if we say, as you rightly said, there's people who see it like that, people who see it like that, then I would say that was always the case, right? There never was uniform worldviews held. When we look historically, there was always contestation. There were always people who saw it differently, heretics and I don't know what, right? So that is important, I think, that historical insight, the pluralism is actually the condition. And then it's narratives that you put above pluralism that make it a worldview. They make it the Enlightenment view. The Enlightenment, if anything, was a period when all people quarreled with each other about what is the right way to do things. Nowadays, in hindsight, and that's where I leave historicity, when we talk today, we tend to divide up history into periods and we have easy ways of generalizing about them. And sometimes I just find it healing to look at the diversity in this phenomenon and see, during the Enlightenment, there was a lot of talk about race, a lot of talk in France about this and that aspect that nowadays we think is the opposite of what the Enlightenment was about. So in that sense, history is important, right? And when we say today there's this plurality, some people see it like this or that, and that's good, I think. It's not pluralism of viewing things differently that one wants to somehow bulldoze, right? Now that's the one thing. The other thing is, and we might want to continue that discussion, right? But now does pluralism mean everything is equally valid? Right? The insight into there are forms of knowledge here and there, many forms. Now, when I have a problem and I break my finger, I don't go to my lawyer. I will actually to sue the person who broke it, but no. But I mean that with expertise in the world, that doesn't mean that you couldn't go to different kinds of medicine practitioners. If it helps, I would be the last person to say don't go and see that doctor or this doctor who does it differently, right? But we generally acknowledge expertise. So if you want to have a carpenter, the table, don't come to me, right? I can't do it, right? So we generally have divide up things like that, and there's something to that. So in other words, I don't think that the understanding that there's plurality out there and plurality is good, that there's internal challenges to a system like science. There's a lot of internal challenge to science by scientists fighting with each other, and that there's external challenge to that. That's all good, but it doesn't follow from that that every knowledge is equally valid, right? There must be some sort of knowledge that's simply wrong, right? We can measure that in different ways. You can say because it doesn't work, right? Pragmatist way of going about it. There's all sorts of ways. But I think if we say everything's equally valid, everything's just as good as anything else, I think that's a dead end, yeah. But I know there's this, one can debate that, right? But I would defend that view, I think.
Thank you.
Thank you. We have some people who have come back. Please, just wanted to welcome them again. Please.
All right. So I just want to say I've been listening to this exchange, yes. So it brings me back to the feeling that it seems like we are still in the academy, where it's all we are formed into military battalions in the form of disciplines, and yes, well, some of the things I wanted to say, I forgot. I think my two colleagues have already said them. But someone gave an example about, knowledge not being political, being that what you know about yourself or what you have. And I think an example of COVID was thrown on that this is what you can be if you have COVID and then all that. But I want to say that even what I know about myself can be very political. Like I am political in my being, not in my thinking or in my way of doing, but in my being. I'll just give a simple. I am political, highly political.
But can you define it?
Yeah, the moment
What do you mean by
look at me-
political?
by political, okay, there is a history attached to it. Perhaps maybe I can come back to that later. But the moment you look at me, you already politicize me by virtue of being in the skin color that I'm living in this hair that I'm living in this body that I'm living in, because I'm said to be living in a woman's body. So it's political. And then I cannot say this is what I know about myself, and I assert myself in that regard. Because today I am here, most of us, we are asserting ourselves as women, and women, we are Black women, and this is what is happening. But then, before we could assert ourselves as such, what are the conditions that lead to that assertion? It's not me. It's if the conditions were different, I could have been something else. I could have not been a Black woman who aligns with, say, those that align with intersectionality. I could be something freer than maybe where I am. So it's all this is highly political. Um, and then I think one thing that also interested me, you spoke about, people having a choice to choose whether they want to go to a particular medical practitioner or health practitioner in order to get help. It's a reality that we live in a world that there are those that are privileged than the others, and those that are seen to be practitioners than the others. Others are just, they're not, practitioners and so on. So I think maybe we still need, I feel that at the end of um, um, this gathering, we still need to go and reflect on it again and ask really, um, have we managed to break the box? Not only getting out of it, but just breaking that box altogether so that we can be, because it cannot be that, you Yeah, sorry. But anyway.
No, thank you so
Thank
much.
you.
I think that these are some excellent points. Some excellent points. I accept the second point particularly. That the first one, I think, when I asked you, what do you mean by political? I was a bit rude to ask, but I wanted to be clear that I understand that you say everything's political. And that means, if I understood you correctly, from the moment you're thrown into the world, you're living in a political world, right? We're there again.
The midwife says to my mother, it's a girl. And what?
Push.
Hmm? Oh,
She says push.
oh, push. Okay, it starts then. Okay. And then it's a girl. And then it's like I have been given this identity right there. It's a girl. And then there is an expectation. That expectation is political. It's a girl,
No,
and this is what they
completely.
should
I
do.
mean, that point I think we can readily agree on. We can claim that from the moment you're in this world, you're living in a political world. So that means power structures in there. We need to understand. If you want to change them, right, you need to understand them even better, right? All agreed on. I think what I tried to think about this morning was just, is that the end of the story? Right? And my challenge was to say, but from the moment you're born, you're in a legal world. You're in so many worlds, right? So that's the conditions for being thrown into a world that is not your making, right? You never chose to be born at this place or that place, to be born in a world that is largely structured around nation states. It doesn't depend where in the world. When you were born, it's not your doing that you're born there. Right? You cannot, even if you're born in Great Britain, one of the great colonizers, it's not your choosing it. I think it's an important thing to emphasize, right? Wherever you end up, it's not your choosing, right? So that I think, and we also can agree it's political from the beginning. Now, my point this morning was, if that is the only notion of the political that we have, right? Don't you lose out on trying to change what you think is not right in this world? Wouldn't it be good to also have another concept of the political, which is discriminatory in the sense of saying, and this is political, that is not political? If you give up that, how do we talk, right? Because we also thrown in a legal world, in a religious world, you can take any adjectives. And if we go beyond the divisions in a more holistic point of view, right? Then you can argue that case that everything is political. But I think we are discussing almost like two things. One is a description of the world, right, that we live in. The other is how should we talk when talking about the concrete phenomenon. That's not necessarily completely divided from each other. But I think we lose out in what we can achieve when we agitate or when we do this or that, or try to change things, right? If we just rely on this, everything is political. As important as it is, I would also want to have a second sort of vocabulary where I can say, oh, I don't want to understand this as political, but that. There's a lot of power behind discrimination, distinctions, as we talked in the morning, right? And if we think about those whom you think hegemonize the system, those whom we think are problematic, are just looking for their interests or whatever it is, you can be sure they use distinctions. I mean, colonialism and distinction making would be a great topic, right? How the colonizers have used distinctions. Anybody who exerts power by making distinctions, by building categories to put people in, to put things in, all of that. It's a feature of power, right? That you have the power. Who said that? Somebody said the power to divide the world, right? Of course, that's very important. But it's not just important, I think, and that maybe is my final point for the moment, right? To just look at those who you think are problematic, those who you want to argue against, or to move against, how they use distinctions. I think it's as important to understand how you yourself are using distinctions at that moment. So if we divide up the world into north and south, yeah, there's some things you can do with that, but you can be sure you run into problems by that very division itself again, right? Because now you're dividing up the world in a different way, and that's just not the right way of dividing up the world. There's no such thing, I think, right? There's always, and so my point is, can't we be as critical of the others, be as critical with ourselves when we use that, and see the next power relation that others will come and criticize? You can be sure. People are clever. They will come and tear your argument apart, and they will say, oh, you shouldn't have distinguished that. That distinction is very bad, right? And once one has understood that, I think one can be a bit more tolerant with distinctions and then ask, so what is that distinction good for? And what is it bad for? Right? But it's not the distinction that's the problem. It's how distinctions are used. And I try to make us think about whether knowledge is not the same thing. It's not the knowledge as such that is the bad thing. It's how it's used, how it's done, what is done to it to people, right? That is what makes knowledge problematic. But if we don't see that anymore, then I think we almost go into isolation. We don't know what, we lose power. Right? We lose the power to criticize science as this sort of project or that sort of project. So I would still, I think, in the end, try to argue that way. But that's the point of, I mean, we said at the beginning we'll go in circles, right? And I hope we did a lot of circles this morning, but we didn't find the answers. And I can see how there's critical points about this distinction between politics, non-politics, knowledge, politics, right? That we rightly will continue to discuss. Right? Politicization we had as a point. Does that mean that something's not political and then it is political? Should we just not use the term anymore if everything's political? What does politicization mean then? Right? There must be, if we say politicization is a term we want to use, we say something's not political and then it is. We might also want to say something is political in one way and now it has been politicized, it's political in another way. Right? There's all sorts of things we can think of. But I think it's important to know what we do so we can be as powerful or critical with whatever you agitate for as you want to. Yeah. Let's see. We have 20 minutes. My slides have not been up yet, but don't you worry. It would have been an example to discuss those things. Please.
Merci.
En
fait, ma préoccupation va plutôt dans le sens de se demander, est-ce que ce n'est pas la politique qui a plutôt corrompu la connaissance? Parce qu'en fait, nous savons absolument que la connaissance elle-même, vous l'avez dit, ne peut pas être en soi source de mal. Mais est-ce que ce n'est pas l'introduction de la politique dans la connaissance qui a fait de celle-ci une source de mal, une source de conflit? Parce que en fait, c'est ce qu'en fait Bernard Stiegel appelle le caractère manichéen de la connaissance, que la connaissance, si la connaissance est devenue à la fois solution et en même temps poison, pharmacon, ce qu'il appelle pharmacon, voilà. Donc, si en fait la connaissance est une sorte de pharmacon, c'est peut-être en fait la politique. Donc, moi, je me dis que c'est en fait l'introduction, l'accaparement de la connaissance dans la politique qui a effectivement détourné celle-ci de son sens originel. Parce que le sens originel de la connaissance, c'était effectivement le bonheur, c'était effectivement la libération de l'homme, c'était effectivement de faire de l'homme un être humain. Parce que le processus d'humanisation de l'homme ne serait pas possible s'il n'y avait pas la connaissance. Parce que, comme on le dit souvent, si l'homme se distingue de l'animal, c'est effectivement la connaissance. L'animal n'agit pas par connaissance, l'animal agit instinctivement. Mais l'homme, lui, en fait, il n'a pas ce droit d'agir instinctivement. L'homme agit par connaissance et par science. Mais si cette connaissance-là est devenue effectivement problématique aujourd'hui, au point que l'homme se sert de la connaissance pour porter atteinte à l'intégrité morale et à l'intégrité morale et physique de son prochain, c'est parce qu'effectivement, on a fait de la connaissance une affaire politique. C'est en fait là le véritable problème, que la connaissance est devenue mauvaise par le simple fait qu'elle a été politisée. L'exemple la COVID, on peut prendre l'exemple de la
Thank you so
COVID.
much, yeah.
On peut aussi prendre beaucoup d'exemples concernant effectivement voilà, l'idéologie qui s'est emparée de la science. On peut même revenir en arrière au XVIIIe siècle, où même la science a été au service de l'idéologie occidentale. Prenons l'exemple de Carl von Linné. Carl von Linné, qui fut effectivement l'un des premiers théoriciens de la race. OK? Et c'est là, effectivement, où de la campagne parle effectivement de la science comme effectivement idéologie. Où effectivement on en a fait effectivement une affaire politique, et quand on a fait une affaire politique, on a fait plutôt effectivement un instrument de domination. Donc l'articulation, c'est pourquoi je disais tout à l'heure que l'articulation entre la politique et la connaissance peut déboucher tout simplement à la perte de l'identité de la connaissance dans son sens originel, dans son sens essentiel, dans son sens philosophique en fait.
Thank you so much. I said before, right, we're always telling stories also and histories. And of course, it's one specific history to say, with the Greeks, and you were quoting Plato, the Pharmakon, right, that there was knowledge and there was politics, and then it got maybe mixed up. And in the Enlightenment, we find that distinction again. And nowadays, knowledge is driven by politics again, and that's a threat, I think, in your view, right? It's a way of telling the history, and I think there's like with every history, I could give a speech now seconding you, or I could try to give a speech trying to counter your argument, right? It's one of the offers out there. Before I try to make the point that in the Enlightenment is a construction of itself. It's a construction that we use in hindsight, and then we generalize largely. It's actually still today quite valuable to see what else was also said in the Enlightenment. So I'm not sure. That I think would be my challenge to you, right? I think I see what you're thriving at, and I'm sympathetic to that. I'm not quite sure knowledge was ever really so detached from politics. So when Plato, Socrates, when they talk about that, whom are they arguing against? Arguing against sophists, right? Who are the sophists? Those who understood how to sell knowledge, right? So there was always this element there. And in the Enlightenment, if we would look historically, of course, it was also mentioned. That does not mean that normatively, I would not align with you that the distinction is important. I was just dissociated from the historical narrative. I think in the historical narrative, those things always went together. That does not mean I could not be here and say we should distinguish that. There should be a realm where knowledge can be produced as autonomously as possible, even if it's an ideal, right? And then we can discuss. That doesn't go against each other. I just think in the historical narrative, these things, even with the ancient Greeks, right, was always both at the same time. I think you raised an important point that I want to talk quickly about: ideology. Ideology is powerful. And I would actually agree with you if what you meant by the recent phenomenon, how knowledge is being politicized, right? These are times in which ideologies on all sorts of sides, right, try to impose what is knowledge and what is not knowledge. For me personally, and since you like Plato, if we do an inquiry, and then you know Meno's paradox, right? In the dialogue, Meno has a beautiful paradox where he says, so if you inquire into something, right, and you know what you're looking for, why are you looking for it? If you inquire into something and you don't know what you're looking for, how do you know you found it? What that means is, if you inquire into something, you don't know what comes out of it. And I think there's something I hope we should be able to agree on, maybe, that when we inquire into something, we want to find out something. Now, if we know what we will find, then we are being ideological, right? Then we're not really looking. We're just confirming what we already believe. And that's an intricate line. And on all sides of the discourse today, but also on the decolonial side, I would say. Ideology often takes priority. It would have been a quote on my slide by Boaventura de Sousa Santos where he says, recognition precedes cognition, right? And that, I think, encapsulates what it means if you have an ideological agenda. You know what comes out. You can't be surprised by what you're trying to find out. I don't think that's a good state of affairs, right? I think we should always be open to say, damn, I thought it's this way. Now I found out my argument about race or this doesn't hold, right? I must think harder about it. But if we as and whether that one calls that academia or not, I know there's a big discussion, of course, about academia and its place. And we want to be critical of that, right? I still think it's good to have some places where thinking is specifically looked at and enabled, maybe spaces of where we can disagree without killing each other, right? It's good to have such a place. How we call it, I don't care that much, right, about it, right? But this, if ideology is how we go into discussions with each other, then that's not ideal, I think, right? So I should have come this morning with my slides prepared, and after discussing with you, thought, that one there wasn't really good, right? I should have phrased it differently. Maybe I'm completely wrong about it. If I don't have that, right, then I'm not sure what we're doing here, and vice versa, of course. So if we just go to meetings to reconfirm beliefs we already have, we'd rather drink beer. More or coffee or whatever it is, right? More satisfying, maybe. And if I wonder if you would agree that when we talk about science, there's one element of it, the element of being of accepting that one can be wrong about something, right? If that is not in science, then I think the whole thing is for nothing. That doesn't mean that science is not political and all the other elements also, but I think it is a foundational element of what one tries to do. It doesn't have to call it science, we can call it inquiry. Whatever we want, a riddle, a question we have, right? It doesn't have to be science with a capital S, if I can make the analogy to marriage, right? I think we want to do science without supporting the institution of science that is problematic in many ways, right? But we also can do it with seeing some of the institutions actually going well. One could also make that argument. So maybe we don't have to throw out the baby with the bathwater, right, when criticizing it. So it's complicated in that sense. Now, did you have a hand up there before? I don't want to even.
It's not a question.
No, you're also free to do a comment.
Yes. Please, I need some summarize because we were not here. Please. Little.
Now, that's the biggest challenge I've received today. I was counting on it being recorded, and afterwards I can look at it, then I know what I said and what others said. Now you make me remember it. No, I think what we had, the discussion actually just continued from what we did in the morning. So I didn't present anything more. We just went through the remaining questions and comments. And I think we just had a discussion still about the view, is everything political? What's the benefit of holding that view, of rejecting that view? What would it mean to distinguish between something we consider political and something not? And for me personally, one of the insights that I took away from this morning is maybe it's not two competing things. Maybe we just haven't clarified enough for in what sort of conditions, for what purpose do we want to hold the view everything's political? What can that do, that view, right? How can you use that view to maybe argue against something, criticize something? And that does not have to be necessarily in contradiction with, no, I want to say this is political, this is not political. To use another language, it's not clear whether the two sentences, everything's political, or the two views, everything is political, and the view, maybe I want to distinguish between something and say, that's political, that's not political, whether you're in the same language game when you do that, whether you're playing the same game, right? You're in the same sort of endeavor. I would think that to distinguish between this is political and this is not political. It's a natural thing you do when you inquire into something, right? The view that everything is political, I think, can be used quite effectively if you argue for a group that thinks, no, this is economics and only economics, right? We're not doing politics. And then I think it's a powerful view to throw at them and say, but look, right? You're just doing this and that. Isn't that political? Right? So it's a good challenging view. I think it can be used to challenge groups of people holding a view that no, we're just doing academia, or we're just doing art, or we're just doing this or that, right? But then what you do is actually you cash in on that power of dividing, introducing distinctions that we were talking in the morning about. The moment you introduce a distinction, you can challenge it for good reason. But the point of introducing a distinction is often another one, right? So what are distinctions good for, right? So I think for me, I would love to think more about this. Then we had the point of positionality that we came back to. And it is a big chunk in there, right? And I know it's important in decolonial theory. And I see what for. I just wanted to maybe caution against making it a dogma and a positive dogma only. So I was arguing for understanding positionality as enabling to criticize, for instance, but also as constraining yourself at the same moment, right? Because you don't see things in three ways, but only in one way because of your. So it has something you want to transgress positionality in many ways. Learning, going to different places means expanding your positionality, right? So you could also frame it that way, right? Enriching your positionality, maybe seeing things differently than you saw them before because of your positionality. And then there was some maybe you said discomfort, right, about this distinction that you raised. So it's a vivid topic, but I think positionality, there's still a lot more to think about what that actually means. So if it's thrown in all too quickly, in my view, right, then I think we're not doing ourselves a service by doing that. So similarly, maybe with positionality, we still want to be very clear what we mean by it and not, right? Does it exclude criticality? That was, I think, a misunderstanding we had, where I would say, no, it doesn't. It's more there, even though I cannot articulate it so clearly what it is. But it's something I actually really plan to think about, right? Positionality, its role in discourse. And what that means if you argue for positionality for your own argument, because that would then be an expression of positionality itself, where you get into difficult terrain. Right? But I'm sure others would have different summaries, right? Which just proves the point about positionality in some sense. So I cannot really do justice to everyone with my summary, but accept my positionality. It's hard to argue what you're not positioned to argue for. So that's difficult. Now, there were some other things, but these are some of the things that I took away from this morning. We're also almost there, right? Maybe that's an attempt at summarizing. I also see we are 3 minutes to 1. Now, I haven't put up my slides. They would have been very powerful. Such clever slides that you will never see now. And no, I'm joking. I can still send the slides around. We see some quotes that I would have loved to quarrel about with you, about what you now think when you read that, right? Whether you could say, what does this person understand by politics, by knowledge, and then do we agree or disagree, right? But that's the level I think we want to engage with texts. And if we could have come today to the point, oh yeah, we need to question the question, right? We need to be clear about that. We had the devil in the detail discussion, which I recognize, right? So there's ample room for that, right? So with that, 2 minutes to go, I think I'm free to end 2 minutes early. Oh, we have 2 minutes still. That's good.
Sorry, I just wanted to, because Omar brought up this idea of how politics is making knowledge kind of what is ruining knowledge in a way. So I just like, especially the last few hundred years, how I understand politics in the first place is an exercise of power, right? Or like some form of governance, whether it's self-familiar, community, state level, whatever you view it as. But this idea, especially over the last few hundred years, like you cannot separate the two or view them because we discussed Enlightenment thinkers, right? You have perhaps like John Locke, like talked about all men are equal, even though he invested in slave ships. But that idea was so powerful and it dictated so much. But you go back to Zero Yacob, which was perhaps a century before him, and he had written that in a much more even less contradictory way, to say the least. And then you have like
is about strive, and to know is to strive in so many ways, and to assert a particular knowledge is to strive to be human. So politics for me are never benign. Thank you.
Thank you so much. You also said it better, but I have a story to finish with. You know, there's a story about a rabbi, right, in Israel, and in a village. And the rabbi is the person you turn to when you have a quarrel. So you go, and that person will decide who's right. And there were two people struggling with each other, fighting. And they went to the rabbi. And the one person went first, right? And told the entire fight he had, everything. And the rabbi listened. And at the end, the rabbi said, "Oh, you're right." Right? So the second person goes and tells the family, right? The rabbi listens. And at the end says, now all of that time, the wife of the rabbi was behind the curtain. She goes in and she says, "But rabbi, how can you say he's right and he's right?" And you know what the rabbi said? "You're right." I think that may be how we want to end the session. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So thank you very much, dear colleagues. Thank you, Ralph, for a wonderful discussion that you promoted here this morning. I think it was a very good way of ending our summer school because we came back to the main question, and we discussed it in all possible ways, and we came to the realization that it's okay to live without an answer, and that's good. So we are going to. I mean, the dignitaries are here now, so so you are automatically demoted when the dignitaries arrive. So I will have to ask them to say a few words before, as planned, we go and have lunch and then come back for the closing session. And maybe since we are not going to really work afterwards, we can try to be on time this time. So yes, so we want to go for lunch and then come back. But I thought you might want to say something now. No. Okay. Okay, so we have permission to go and have lunch now, and it's 1 o'clock. So I would suggest that we come back at 2. At 2, yeah, yeah. Oh, the better. Oh, okay, okay. So that's what we're going to do.